But there was a lot of fun at the same time. I mean, you know, we had maypoles in this country. We had a 12-day rest from work at Christmas when you weren't allowed to work. You were expected to go to church a lot, but there were lots of feasts and fun and parties as well. But this whole culture was considered completely superstitious, old-fashioned, irredeemably popish. All these people were going to hell by the new Puritan reformers. So we're talking about people like Calvin and Luther. And if you talk to Americans today, they say they work under this sort of Calvinist work ethic. And this was something quite new. So this old, possibly corrupt, laid-back system of the medieval Christianity was overthrown all across Europe. More or less, the culture was more individualistic. The Puritan and the Protestant culture that replaced the old medieval one was more individualistic. And now you were allowed, in a sense, to work very hard. You were allowed to work hard on this God's earth. It was okay to be rich. It could be seen as a sign that God favoured you, whereas merchants previously had been viewed with some suspicion. You know, the miser with his money bags was a character to be derided. The medieval church had actually frequently attacked the bankers who lent money and charged interest on the loans, and that was called usury. And there was a long history in Judaism and in Christianity and in Islam today of criticising lending money at interest, particularly if it was done to the poor, if it was directed down to the poor. But the prohibition against usury was gradually lifted under people like Calvin and Luther. And Henry VIII, as I've said, smashes up the monasteries. He also removes, in the process, a kind of welfare state that had been operated by the Christian Church. Because, you know, anybody could more or less get educated at the monastery. They would look after the homeless and the sick, and because this was a Christian thing to do, you know, it was good for you to give to a beggar because it was going to help you to get into heaven. So you actually had a Tudor homeless problem because the homeless weren't being looked after, and there was a new load of homeless, and the monks and the nuns who now had nowhere to go. So this was really a huge change. And in the 17th century, in the 16th and the 17th century, attitudes really begin to change towards work and towards money making. It becomes more acceptable to make a lot of money. People had been fascinated by riches in the past, of course, as well, but now it was a more common aim. Now, under the Commonwealth, under Cromwell, I mean, Cromwell, remember, ruled for 15 years. There was no king, and he was a bit of a Lenin. It was supposed to be a sort of equal communist state, but a lot of the old fun was taken away. So maypoles were taken down because they were seen as kind of heathenish, stinking idols, popish, superstitious. But people had loved the maypoles, and the old medieval church had kept a lot of the old-fashioned people's pleasures in place. Things like drinking and dancing around the maypole. But the maypole was seen as a relic of the old-fashioned popish religion, was sort of evil. Cromwell also bans Christmas, so that's another kind of idle pleasure that was taken away. So I think idleness really suffers at this point in the 17th century. And I don't think it's a coincidence that one of the best-selling books of the 17th century, which we'll come on to later, is called The Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton, who was an Oxford scholar. And this is a huge 700 or 800 page 17th century self-help book to help people deal with being depressed. And so you could conclude that there are a lot of depressed people in the 17th century. And you could also conclude that people were depressed because a lot of their fun had been taken away under this new regime. And they weren't really allowed to be idle. And a great resistor of this culture was Isaac Walton, who wrote The Complete Angler, which was a guide to fishing. It was a guide to fishing. It was a fishing handbook, if you like. But it's a political work because he attacks the Puritans and the Protestants, and he says they're sour-faced, money-getting men. We anglers know how to sit here doing nothing, and we love the contemplative life. In fact, he says in that's a great kind of idler's text. It's a lovely book to read. And he says, you know, the argument between whether it's better to lead an active life or contemplative life has been raging for centuries, thousands of years probably. And he says, but with fishing, with angling, we combine the two in happy harmony, because a lot of it's about just sitting there doing nothing, staring at water. So you've got the Taoist thing of connecting with nature and doing nothing, and being near to water is therapeutic. But you're also doing something quite useful, catching food, hunting, and there is some activity and bustle associated with it. So the complete angler says this is just the ideal human pursuit is fishing. And fishing is very popular today, and I think it's because it's a way of reclaiming some idle time and some time with nature, and just time to more or less do nothing, but with this kind of cover of a purpose. Now, in the Restoration, when the king comes back to the throne in 1665, roughly, the theatres open again, and people actually like Charles II, the Merry Monarch. He's got long hair, he has a kind of licentious court, and he loves going to the theatre, he loves drinking, he loves pleasure. He's called the Merry Monarch. He surrounds himself with these sort of pleasure-loving, fun-loving people, and the poets and so on, and the Nell Gwynns. And that kind of sets the tone. You could argue that this is sort of corrupt and old-fashioned, but something deep in the people actually seems to quite like this, and they love the fact that the theatres have reopened and fun comes back into everyday life. So I think idleness in the late 17th century perhaps is reintroduced, and people don't feel so guilty about it. Now, in the 18th century, in the run-up to the Industrial Revolution, which is a really bad moment in our history for idlers, you get this really lovely period in the middle of the 18th century of a new kind of journalism in London, with people like my hero, Dr. Johnson. Now, Dr. Johnson wrote a series of essays called The Idler, and they were printed in 1758 and 1759, and they were published in a magazine called The Gentleman's Magazine. This is from the early 19th century, a collection of Dr. Johnson's works. And it was when I was lying in bed, feeling guilty about not working harder in my early 20s, living in Portobello Road, that I found a collection of writings by Dr. Johnson. And first off, I was really comforted to find that he was naturally very lazy, and was always resolving to get up earlier and work harder, and that's what I was always doing too. So I was always thinking, well, I've got to get up early, I'm not working hard enough, and so on. He would lie in bed till lunchtime, till 2 or 3 in the afternoon, doing nothing, perhaps reading, perhaps receiving visitors. Then he'd involve himself in chemistry experiments to kind of distract himself, and in the evenings would go out. No one knew really quite when he got his work done, because he was hugely productive. So what I discovered in Dr. Johnson, writing the Idler essays, and being the foremost man of letters really of his day, he wrote an English dictionary with help. He wrote numerous biographies and poems and plays and essays and everyday journalism, which he wrote for money. He was self-employed freelance hack. He provides an example of idleness in action in a way, the sort of positive, the positive sides of idleness, and he shows how idleness is an important part of the creative process. And in this essay, the first one, printed April 15, 1758, the Idler #1. He has some great lines. Every man is, or hopes to be, an idler. So he's saying, just as peace is the purpose of war, it's supposed to be at the end of war, the goal of war is peace. The goal of business, which by the way in Latin was neg otium, meaning not leisure. It was your business. The goal of business is to create leisure at the end. We have the idea of retirement, of course. And still people think they're going to kind of make a lot of money and then retire. They sadly rarely do, because they get addicted to their outgoings. He also explains in The Idler that the idler works in a similar way to the principle of momentum. So, a kind of heavy body is forced up a hill and then falls very quickly and heavily on the other side. So, and the heavier it is and the slower you push it up, the quicker it's going to fall. And that's what he said idleness was like, or the way an idler works. So the longer you sit there doing nothing, the more quickly you'll be able to get the work done at the end. And personally, for me, that's a very appealing way of working. And it's not that you're actually being lazy either. It may look to somebody else like you're just lying in bed or staring out the window. But at some level, your mind's going. So I thought this was a very attractive idea, and that's Dr. Johnson really is at the basis of this idea of promoting idleness as a good thing in life. He actually personally, I don't think ever quite came to terms with this, and it was quite close to depression for him. And we're going to come on to the idea of melancholy in a future talk. Now, what about idleness in the 19th century? Well, it takes a step back for sure at the end of the 18th century with the Industrial Revolution. So in some senses, this is a hugely exciting period because industry really gets going. I mean, industry is the opposite of idleness, isn't it? It was opposed to idleness. There's the industrious worker and the idler, and you should be industrious. So the Industrial Revolution, to me, is like a kind of revolution of industry against the naturally idle spirit of the English people, and industry kind of wins. But not without a fight. The sort of naturally bloody-minded English peasantry didn't particularly like being told to go into a factory for 12 or 14 hours a day on time. They'd been more used to working in small groups where there were mini factories. They might not even go in at all on Monday or Tuesday because they had a hangover. There was a custom called Saint Monday, which is the day you took off every Monday to honour Saint Monday, but it was basically because you were nursing your headache from the weekend drinking. But then they would work harder towards the end of the week. So you might work very hard on a Friday and late on Saturday. And that's the kind of working pattern that students and freelance journalists can still pursue today. And indeed anybody who's self-employed, if you do work at home, then you can take a nap after lunch, but you might be quite productive. Against this, later in the 19th century, against this revolution where everyone has to work very hard and there's a migration from the countryside into the city, people are working in factories. And at the beginning, it's completely unregulated, and women and children are literally dying from overwork in the factories, and 12-year-old boys are dying. And as the 19th century goes on, under pressure from philanthropists and I suppose charitable individuals, the government gradually increases things like the 10-hour day and limits the working day so that people will basically stop dying. And later you get a kind of resurgence of idleness and the idea of the idler in another magazine, The Idler, edited by Jerome K. Jerome, who wrote Three Men in a Boat and was the sort of foremost Edwardian humorist. Three Men in a Boat was a huge bestseller. It sold millions of copies, particularly in the States. And but before that, he'd edited this magazine called The Idler for about 20 years with a friend of his called Robert Barr. And you can see here there's, on the cover, there's an Edwardian chap with a pipe, loafing in a hammock, enjoying himself. And this was a kind of statement of, to me, civilised values against the work-hard culture of the Victorian period. And he wasn't the only one who was standing up for that. Oscar Wilde also said that, man's not made to work. You shouldn't ask people what they do at parties. You should ask them who they are, what they're thinking. And he and others stand up for a kind of bohemian artistic approach to life, where everyone should be an artist or a philosopher, and escape the wage slavery. And Wilde himself is influenced by the anarchists, of the famous anarchist of the time, not known now, Kropotkin, Prince Kropotkin, who was a 19th century anarchist. And he felt that, where people did work, they should work in small groups and that you should own the means of production. In the 20th century, you get the Bohemians in the 1920s, and that's quite a fun period in English life, the 1920s, where really everything's up for grabs. The old morals go out the window. Men and women are more equal. People again try to live a kind of artistic life, but that's kind of destroyed really by the in the late 30s by the Second World War. But also the 20th century, little movements pop up: the beatniks, the hippies. These ideas are all through the Beatles songs, particularly in John Lennon. So he has songs which express these Taoist sentiments. You know, "I'm only sleeping" is famous. "Turn off your mind, relax, and float down the stream." So the Beatles brought in, and there's always somebody in the culture bringing these ideas back in. Before them, in the 50s, it was the situationists in Paris, the philosophers who scrawled on the subway walls, "Ne travaillez jamais," never ever work. People like Guy Debord, who committed suicide, Ralph Vaneigem, who's still alive today, the 1968 student protests. They influenced the next real movement to bring up these ideas, which was punk. So if you listen to the lyrics of Never Mind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols, it's full of these actually ancient ideas against work, against consumption, against conforming. Their everyday clothes, like the Brethren of the Free Spirit, are ripped and torn. There's no way they're going to get a job dressed like that with green hair and safety pins everywhere. And what do they do all day? Nothing. They stand around on the King's Road, you know, drinking. I want to destroy passers-by. So, and Johnny Rotten says, you know, "We don't work, we just feed, that's all I need." So it's a kind of statement of the bare necessities, if you like. You know, I don't want he says, "I don't want the big house, I don't want a big car," and so on. I'm going to kind of try and find a way. It's difficult, but I'm going to try and find a way of avoiding all this stuff and being free. The hippies and the punks are rebelling against those old enemies: early rising and hard work, application, servitude to your boss, you know. And this idea of wage slavery has been a frequent phrase in the 19th century, you know. A job is a kind of form of voluntary slavery, if you like. So what are the ways that you can escape from that? I think what I'm saying as well is that there's a sort of romantic part to life which we should encourage, and you know, we like romantic poets. We in general love pop stars, singers, philosophers, and poets. They add something. They add the culture to the life, but the culture springs from idleness and doing nothing. People tend to prefer the poet to the banker, and this isn't something new, and this is something that we need to kind of embrace. I think you can put romanticism and utilitarianism in opposite corners of the boxing ring. And utilitarianism, promoted by people like Jeremy Bentham, is really the idea that, you know, utility is what life is all about, what's actually useful to your everyday life, and that tends to be things like money. Romantics are saying, no, there's this whole area of life which is completely useless. It doesn't really profit anybody. It's kind of a waste of time being idle. But actually that's the real stuff of life. That's where life is really, really lived. In the pub and when you're chatting with friends and when you're not thinking about how to advance your career. Those things, yes, are important for your fulfillment and to make money, but is that the real part of life? Businessmen say, you know, idlers are wandering around with their heads in the clouds. They don't live in the real world. Which is the real world? Is it the world of the mind? Is it flowers and grass and taking a walk with friends and reading and poetry? You know, you could argue that that's the real world, and the world of finance, interest payments, bank loans, and business is the world of the imagination. I'm going to end with a few little inaction points. So we're going to call these inaction points at the end of each of these sessions. A few things that you could perhaps do in everyday life to introduce some of these idle thoughts into your life. We could start with the idea of cultivating your leisure. We all have leisure time, but can we do something different with it, which isn't just shopping and TV? And we're going to look into that a bit more deeply in one of the later sessions. A lunch hour. That's an easy way to get a bit of idle time into your life. Go to the church, sit in the back of the church, sit on a park bench, lie in the park. There are all sorts of ways to be idle within a job and within the city. Walking to the office is a lovely thing to do. If you're getting the bus, go upstairs if you have double-decker buses. And instead of reading the morning paper, take a slim volume of verse and do what Keats recommended, actually. Just read a few lines of a poem or a bit of prose in the morning and let the words ferment, if you like, in your mind through the day. And you only have to read a couple of lines of a poem by Keats, would be great, an ode on indolence or something like that, to give yourself a little kind of vision of something a bit wider than the morning paper and the depressing news on the radio. I think I'll wind up there with our inaction points. Just remember those 2 points. What we're trying to reach in these lessons and classes is control over your life, autonomy. So if you want to change your life for the better, I'm saying it is possible, but we'll start slowly. Change your life, but change it very slowly. That concludes part 1. Part 2, we're going to discuss the more practical idea of being thrifty. So I hope you'll come back for that. Thank you very much.